Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is sectionalism, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. You learned this word sectionalism already. It means disunity between the northern states and the southern states. In other words, sectionalism is the feeling that the North and the South were so different from each other that people who lived in each region no longer shared anything in common. Eventually, the North and the South started to feel like they weren't even in the same country. And what I want to tell you about in this video is how those two regions were different and why their differences caused tension. Get ready to fill in your vocab sheet. Now we're going to look at some of these sectional differences. In Unit 1, you saw how during the colonial period, the northern and southern colonies were different from each other in significant ways. Their geographic features were different, and as a result, their main economic activities, the things that people did to make money, were also different. And these differences grew larger during the era of westward expansion. Let's start with the North. The northern states had an industrial economy. That meant that many people in the North earned their living from factory production. In global history, you learned about the Industrial Revolution in England, which began around 1770. Not long after that, businessmen in northern states like Massachusetts began copying British ideas and setting up their own factories. And it wasn't long before the North was very industrial with a lot of factories in many states. Here is a picture of a factory in Massachusetts. The North also became more urbanized. That means that it had more cities, and that's because cities grew around the factories. There were several large cities in northern states. And finally, the North relied on what is called free or wage labor. And factory owners relied on immigrants to work in their factories. Most of the workers were poor immigrants from England and Ireland. Wage labor or free labor means that each worker received an hourly wage for their work and was responsible for paying for their own clothes, food, and lodging. It's called free labor to contrast with slave labor, in which the worker had no free will. Northerners favored a free labor system, both because they thought it was more efficient than slavery and because they thought slavery was morally wrong. So, to sum up, the North was becoming more industrial, more urbanized, and more dependent on free or wage labor of immigrants. Okay, now let's look at the South. In 1800, the South was more agricultural than the North. The vast majority of people worked on small farms and grew their own food. A smaller number of people, the wealthier and more powerful members of society, owned large plantations and used slaves to grow cash crops like tobacco, indigo, and rice. Since there was almost no industry, there were only a few large cities. Compared to the North, the South was much less urbanized and much more rural. And finally, the South's dependence on slave labor made life there very different from life in the North. And after the year 1800, two things happened that made the South a lot more dependent on slavery. The first was the invention of a new machine called the cotton gin. Take a look at this picture of a cotton plant over here. In the summer, the plant bursts open, revealing the cotton fibers that are ready to be harvested. However, the fibers are also full of seeds. And before the year 1793, it took a lot of time and work to get the seeds out. But 1793 was when a man named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. That's this machine here. The cotton gin pushes the cotton fibers over metal rollers, which quickly separate the seeds. And the cotton gin made it possible to produce a lot more cotton. And it turned cotton into the most profitable cash crop in the South. Southerners started growing a lot more cotton, and it wasn't long before the majority of the Southern economy was based on this single crop. Pretty much all of it was being grown by slaves. The second thing that happened around the year 1800 to increase Southern dependence on slavery and cotton was the Louisiana Purchase. Take a look at this map. Before the Louisiana Purchase, most of the plantations in the South were located on the coast, near the Atlantic Ocean. That's because cash crops were being sold to customers either in the North or across the ocean in Europe. Either way, the goods had to be loaded onto ships, so the plantations tended to be close to the coast. This land down here was excellent for farming cash crops, but it was too far away from the coast and from the markets. The South was pretty rural and didn't have many roads or railroads. That changed with the Louisiana Purchase because the U.S. got control of the Mississippi River and the city of New Orleans. And that meant that all these new lands down here could be used to grow cotton, and the cotton could be loaded onto the Mississippi River and shipped out through New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico. So, after the Louisiana Purchase, white Americans started moving into these lands and setting up cotton plantations. These new areas, which included the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, became new centers of cotton and the places with the greatest numbers of slaves. So, two developments around 1800 led to more cotton production in southern states and more slavery. The first was the invention of the cotton gin, and the second was the Louisiana Purchase. All right, it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, rewind the video and look again. See you in class.